Okay, recording in progress. Good morning, everybody. So we
Okay,
are at the end of, we're coming up to the end of the parak with the bottom of Daf Kafchet Amud Bet. At the bottom, we have a Mishnah. And the Mishnah says as follows. Again, we've been discussing different things which are related to Shechita of an animal, just different issues which are related to Uvdin Dechol. So the Mishnah says, Lo yama adam letabach, shkoli bedinar basar, aval shochet umachalek benehem. Okay, it's continuing this idea of we're going and having the meat shechted, and different people would take obviously different parts. Generally speaking, not one person going to go and take the entire cow. So a person cannot go and say, Lo yomar adam letabach shkoli bedinar basar. Right? Don't say weigh me a dinar's worth of meat. Right? Because a dinar, that's the amount of money that you would pay. So we don't want to mention the payment. That's going to be it's a bona fide weekday activity, right? Or it's related to doing business and the like. So that one should not do. לא יאמר אדם לדבר שקולי בדינר בשר, says Rashi, שקולי בדינר בשר, שאסור להזכיר שם דמים, you can't mention the amount of money that it's going to be worth. אבל שוחט מחלק ביניהם. However, the shochet can, right, you can shochet the meat and you can split it up amongst different people. They'll pay off Yom Tov. Rashi says, or shochet, who, below pisuk damim. You don't establish exactly, you don't say how much each one's going to pay. And they can just split up the meat amongst them. So says the Gemara, okay, so how are you meant to do this, right? You need to split up the meat. You can't mention the amount. So how exactly are you going to do it? So kiha, now it says in different places the way that they would split up the meat or what they would call it. So it says kiha de vesula amri tauta upalgi tauta. Right? In Surah, that's the way they would do it. So it was one of the cities in Babel. They would go and they would say, give me a tauta of meat, or give me half a tauta of meat. Those are the different types, different pieces of meat. That was the name they called it. Rashi here says, we're now at the top of Kaftet Amud Aleph. Rabbi Sula Amri, Darkan Amar Tabach, Ten li tauta or plag tauta. That's what they would say. That's how they would call it. Everybody knew what you were talking about. It's like today, you say, "Give me the number 5 or the number 6 or whatever it is of the meat." Everybody supposedly knows what that means. Nobody knows what that means, but they always have in the butchers. They have the chart, with the different pieces of the meat and the numbers and what the names are. Okay. So in Surah they would have said tarta, right? And so he continues, "Vanilla shamli chalka or palek chalka or pumbedita amli uzia." Right? There were different places where they had different names for it. כל הטבחים היו מנתחים בהמותיהם בשווה, כך וכך נתחים מן הבהמה. So in all these different places, says Rashi, they would cut up the meat in the same way, meaning they would cut it up and they would have equal size pieces. כך וכך נתחים מן הבהמה, ולאותן הנתחים קראו לו, and what were those pieces called? So in different cities they had different names for them. Basula, Tauta, Uvanelish, Chalka, Upumbedita, Uzia, Uvanal, Pakud, Leva. Okay, Leva, maybe. Those are the different names that they had in the different cities. So that's exactly what the Gemara says. It's Basula, Amli, Tauta, Upalgo, Tauta, Benelish, Amli, Chalka, Upalgo, Chalka, Bepumbedita, Amli, Uzia, Upalgo, Uzia, Benal, Pakuda, Uvamata, Mechasya, which is another city. Amli liva ubalgu liva. Okay, and that's just how they would. Even though everybody knows how much it costs for each of those pieces, you're not going to mention explicitly the costs and the money on Yom Tov, but you're going to mention the size of the meat. Okay. Next Mishnah says now as follows: Omer adam lechavero, maleli kli zeh, aval lo b'midah. Rabbi Yoda omer, im haya kli shel midah, lo yemaleno. Let's just read through the Mishnah and then we'll go back and explain. מעשה באבא של בן בטנית, שהממלא מידותיו מערב יום טוב, ונותן ללקוחות ביום טוב. אבא של אומר, אף במועד, עושה כן מפני בירור המידות, והרבה אומר, אף בכל עושה כן מפני מיצוי המידות. Okay, so now we've been discussing taking different portions of meat on Yom Tov. Maybe you want to go take different portions of different foods or oil or whatever it is. Okay. And we know that measuring out specific things on Yom Tov is also a problem, as we've discussed before. We saw the whole Mishnah talking about, which we'll refer to in the Gemara talking about using a measurement for weights for meat and the like. So yeah, what's the case? So we said, "Omer adam l'chavro maleli kli zeh." You say, "I have a pot of a certain size, right? And I want to say, fill this up, right? In other words, you can say fill up the container of a lo b'midah." But you can't say, give me half a liter or whatever. You can't fill it up with the measurement. We're going to see the Gemara is going to have two different interpretations of the Mishnah, exactly what that means. But it's Malay you can say fill up this container, but you can't say fill up with a specific amount, a specific measurement. Now Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im haya kli shel midah, lo yimalena. So Rabbi Yehuda says no. He says if this is a kli that is of a specific measurement, so then just by saying to fill it up, that's already going to be a problem. Right, Rashi says here in the Mishnah, Rashi says, the Gemara is going to explain, because as I say, there's going to be different explanations, what exactly is what does this mean, and what is the argument between Chachamim, between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, right? Tanakama said, you can say, fill up this kli, but not b'midah, not in a measure, and Rabbi Yehuda says, if it was a kli of a measurement, you can't fill it up. Okay, Maseh, and now the Mishnah brings a few cases. מעשה באבא שלו בן ביתנית, שהממלא מידותיו מערב יום טוב, ונותן ללקוחות ביום טוב. So, Abba Shul ben Bitnit, he would fill up the amounts right before Yom Tov, and then he would sell them or give them to the customers on Yom Tov itself. Right? Midotav says Rashi she'en modadin b'Yom Tov. We don't measure on Yom Tov. Abba Shaul Omer af b'moed. Okay, so there's a right. He says af b'moed aseken. So Abba Shaul is more lenient. He says you could even do it on the moed. Rashi here has slightly okay. Rashi has slightly different gears. He says, "Af b'cholosh hamoed aseken." Okay, and he says, "Yeah, b'gmar mefarish tama, v'lo gazin mimanit imnei b'rei amidot, v'ita galis lei v'hen halad al dirot b'gmar mefarish." Okay, there's a number of different gearsaot. The Gemara will explain a little bit more, but he says he would even do it on Yom Tov. We saw Abba Shul ben Bitnit said you cannot measure on Yom Tov. Abba Shul says no, you can measure on the moed. Second, mipnei b'rei amidot. וחכמים אומרים אף בכל עושה כן מפני מיצוי המידות. Meaning, חכמים say even on a weekday this you have to do it like that. Meaning you have to prepare the kli beforehand. Rashi says, yeah, מפני מיצוי המידות, כשהיה מוכר שמן, when you would sell oil, for example, היה לו מידות הרבה, different sizes, right, different sizes of jugs, etc. הוא מבין הלקוחות כליהן, הוא מודד לאיש ואיש במידה לעצמו. ומתאמצות והולכות לתוך כליהן כל הלילה. Meaning they would go and they would give to different people their amounts of oil. So the night before you would go and you would measure out all the different amounts so that everybody would have the amount that they wanted. So now the Gemara says like this, is the following question. We said, the Mishnah started off with this machloket, right? We said, Amar adam l'chavar malei kli ze aval lo b'midah, Rabbi Yehuda Amar, im haya kli shel midah, lo yimalenu. In other words, the Tanakhama, it sounded like he was saying, you can fill up the kli that's for measuring, you just can't say explicitly that you're measuring. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda said, no, even if it's if you're not saying explicitly, that's not the point. The point is whether this is a container which is used for measuring in general. So the Gemara now asks like this: "My aval lo b'midah." What does it mean when we said, right? Malei kli ze aval lo b'midah. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, aval lo b'kli hamiyuchad lemidah. Aval kli haomed lemidah yemalenu. In other words, again, this is going on Tanakama, right? He's saying, what is it that you can't do? So first interpretation says the Gemara, Lo b'kli hamiyuchad lemidah. If it is a container that is specifically used for measuring, So that's what it means that you can't use it. Aval kli aomed lemida yimalenu. But if it's not just right now, I'm going to measure out that amount, right? That is okay. Meaning I haven't set aside this kli as a measuring kli in the past. So for ata Rabbi Yehuda meima, and what does Rabbi Yehuda come to say? He says afilu kli aomed lemida lo yimalenu. He says even that you cannot go and you cannot fall. So Rashi says, העומד למידה, שכשישבר זה, בזה תחתיו, אבל עדיין לא מדד בו. Right? In other words, he's saying, what does it mean the clear העומד למידה? Meaning there's the vessel that I use to measure out the oil, the wine, whatever it is. And it says, if that one was to break, so then I would have this clear that I would use instead to measure, but I haven't actually used it for that purposes yet. So Rabbi Yehuda says, even that you can't. What the Rabbi Yehuda Meima says Rashi, Kevandu atzmo midah. Ulakach hazoi, since this is the proper size, right, and it's made for measuring, although you haven't used it like that yet. Uchdei midah machzik, it holds that specific measurement. Lo yimalenu. The michzi shapir kemoded o mocher keovdin dechol. In other words, Tanakama seems to say, since this is not a kli that you've actually used for measuring, so therefore it doesn't look like you're measuring out, it doesn't look like uvdin dechol. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, at the end of the day, this is still a kli which can be used for measuring. It's the specific size, and therefore you can't use it. So now what comes out of this is, the point is that we see that Rabbi Yehuda is much more machmir than the Tanakama on this. And the Gemara has a question. It says, Alma gabei simchat yom tov, Rabbi Yehuda lechumra, v'Rabbanan lekula. Okay, what we are essentially now saying, all of this relates to Simchat Yom Tov. Why? Because again, we're dealing with how you're going to distribute the food and the oil and whatever that people need for their Yom Tov meals. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda is much more machmir. Rabbi Yehuda turns out being machmir about Simchat Yom Tov, because he's more stringent in terms of what's you're allowed to do or not in terms of Uvdin Dechol, in order to achieve Simchat Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda lechum, Rabbanan lekura. Rabbanan are the ones that are more lenient here. Didn't we say the opposite? How when we already learned something else, we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda is the one actually who's more lenient. Then the Chachamim, where did we see that? So that's what we saw in a Mishnah not that long ago. It's not. Rabbi Yehuda omer shoker adam basar keneged hakli ukeneged hakopitz, v'Chachamim omer mein mashkichem lekaf mazlayim kolika. Remember on Daf Kafchet, so we had a Mishnah, we're talking about weighing up the meat, right? Weighing it up on the scales. So everybody remembers the scales. Now we're in Elul, we're coming up to Rosh Hashanah, right? You've got these massive scales in the sky that are weighing up our mitzvot and averot, right? It's not actually the way it happens, but that's that's the image that everybody has in their mind. And if you say you don't have that image, then you're lying. Okay, but you have these scales, and we said, right, how would the butchers do it? So they would have specific weights. They would put on the one side of the scale, and then you put your meat or whatever on the other side to see how much it weighs. So you can't do that on Yom Tov. You can't measure out, and it's uvdin dechol, and that would be a problem. So we saw in the Mishnah it said. So Rabbi Yehuda said what? He said you can put your meat on one side, on the other side you put your knife, or you put your kli, you put your cleaving knife, etc. Right? And that's enough of a shinoi that it doesn't look completely like uvdin dechol, and that would be accepted. Chachamim said no. Chachamim said you can't do that. Okay, so the stira, the contradiction the Gemara is asking is, over there we saw that Rabbi Yehuda was the one who was more lenient, and over here you're saying no, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says you can't measure out your wine or your oil, etc. for Yom Tov. Surely Rabbi Yehuda should be more lenient, and Chachamim should be more stringent. So it's a question on both Rabbi Yehuda and it's a question on Chachamim. So that's what we are asking. So Alma Rabbi Yehuda lekula Rabbanan lechumra. So over there we see that Rabbi Yehuda is going more lekula, and Chachamim are going more lechumra, as opposed to here where we find precisely the opposite. So therefore we say kasha Rabbi Yehuda, kasha Rabbanan ad Rabbanan. So it's a kasha both on Rabbi Yehuda, who in our case the kelim, of that you're measuring out. Again, both of these ideas are measuring out. That you're weighing the meat. Yeah, you're measuring out the oil or the wine or whatever it may be. So when it comes to weighing the meat, Rabbi Yehuda was lenient. When it comes to measuring out the oil, Rabbi Yehuda was stringent. When it comes to weighing the meat, the Chachamim were stringent. When it comes to measuring out, the other Chachamim were lenient. So that is a kasha in both directions. So what do we do with that? We're about halfway down the page on Daf Kaftet Amud Aleph. Right, we said Amar Rabbi Yehuda Lekor Rabbi Yehuda Kasha Rabbi Yehuda Kasha Rabbi Yehuda. So says the Gemara like this: the Rabbi Yehuda lo Kasha. Let's deal with them one at a time. First of all, regarding Rabbi Yehuda, there is not a contradiction. Why? Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha. Hatam b'she'eino omed lemida. Hacha be'omed lemida. You see, the cases are different. Over there, it's not something which you would normally use. It's not something which you would normally use to measure things, right? What did Rabbi Yehuda say? He said, if you want to weigh the meat, so you take your knife and you put it on the other side of the scale. Nobody uses a knife to measure things. Therefore, that's something different, and therefore that would be, and therefore that would be permitted. Rashi says not on this, but on the section before. Rashi says kli v'kopitz, and you put your kli or your knife or whatever on there. He says enam din lakach. Even if you're using the kli, and maybe that's more of a direct contradiction. But that is not, its purpose was never to go and weigh things. Whereas here, okay, yeah, this kli may be, okay, it may be that you don't use it as your drug to measure, you would only use it if the other one broke or whatever, but ultimately that's what it is. Ultimately that's its purpose, and therefore you cannot use it, it's too much of a uvdin. Okay, so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is not a kasha. Hatam b'sheino omed lemida, hacha be'omed lemida. Now, the Rabbanan, nami lo kasha. Okay, that's also for Rabbanan, for Rabbanan here and there, that is not a contradiction. Why? Hatam ka'avid k'da'avdin b'chol. Hacha lo avid k'da'avdin b'chol. It's all got to do with what is the way that you would normally do it on chol. What is the normal weekday activity? So over there, in the case of weighing, at the end of the day, you're talking about the scales, and you're still using you're still using the scales which are there for weighing, and you're weighing them all the time. But over here, this kli has never been used for measuring. It's not really a measuring kli, and therefore that is not goved in the chol, and therefore the chachamim, that is not going to be a stira either. Have a look at Rashi. He says kedavdin b'chol, b'muznaim. Meaning with the scale, sometimes the weights, the litra, these pieces that you have, which you use for the weights, you don't actually have them. So instead of going and searching everywhere for them, what do you do? Meaning that in itself is an action that the person does do sometimes. Sometimes he does use the scale in that way. However, here, Lo ka'avid k'uvdin d'chol, adayin lo yatsa tivo shel kli zeh lemida. This kli has never been used for measurement. It's just not what it is, not what it's done. Okay, so all of that is one way of explaining the Mishnah and explaining the machlok Raviyah between Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. So we resolved that with Rabbanan Akash Ratam ka'avid k'avdin b'chol, hachalo ka'avid k'avdinan b'chol. Rava Amar, my avalo b'midah. Right, everything we've said until now was Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and that was his interpretation of avalo b'midah in the Mishnah. But Rava is going to say differently. Rava Amar, my avalo b'midah, shelo yizkolo shem midah. אבל כלי המיוחד למידה ימלאנו. ועתה רבי יהודה למימה, כלי המיוחד למידה לא ימלאנו. Okay. So if our first interpretation of the Mishnah was to say as follows, again, the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Tanna Kama, what did the Mishnah say? It said, אומר אדם לחברו, מלא לי כלי זה, אבל לא במידה, and Rabbi Yehuda אומר, מהכלי של מידה לא ימלאנו. So the first interpretation of Yehuda Amar Shmuel's was that it's got nothing to do with what you say, it's got to do with which kelim you are using. right? And Tanakama says if it's a kli that's used for measurement, that's what you can't use. But if it's a kli that's not been used for measurement, but that could be used for measurement, that's okay. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even that you can't. And then we saw. Now, Rabbi is giving a different explanation. Rabbi is saying like this. He says the Mishnah means to say as follows. Rabbi Amar, Ma'ava lo b'midah. What do you mean you want to do b'midah? Shelo yizkor lo she'midah. In other words, you can say, fill up this vessel with oil, fill up this jug with wine. You can't say, fill me up a half a liter in this jug with wine. Then you're explicitly saying that you're going and that you're measuring. Okay, this is going to be much more lenient, but he says, but if it's a kli, and this is the kli that I use, and I know that it's got half a liter, and that's the one I always use to measure, no problem, you can use it, because you're just saying, fill up I want the wine in a jug, so fill it up in this jug. You're not saying that it needs to be a specific measurement. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, if it's a kli specifically for the measurement, so that you cannot, that's what you would always use to measure on a weekday, whatever, that you cannot use. So now says the Gemara, and really the kasha that we said is not dependent on our interpretation of the Mishnah. Really, the fact is that from the Mishnah it comes out that Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent. Right? Whichever way you look at it, Rabbi Yehuda comes along and he's adding a stringency onto what the Tanakhama says. So therefore, says the Gemara now, Alma Gabei Simchat Yom Tov Rabbi Yehuda Chumra Rabbanan Lakula. Okay, this sounds very familiar. That's what we've just seen. So you're saying that again when it comes to Simchat Yom Tov, you're saying that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who is going to Chumra and Chachamim Lakula. Va'ibcha Shaminanu Zitnan Rabbi Yehuda Shokel Adam Basar Keneged Akli or Keneged Akopetz V'Chachamim Omrim Ein Meshkirim B'Kav Nanaim Kolika. Right? Didn't we see in that previous Mishnah that was exactly the opposite? That right, that we saw that Rabbi Yehuda over there was one who was lenient in terms of the scales, in terms of weighing out the meat. Right, Va'ibcha Shaminanu Zitnan Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shokel Adam Basar Keneged Akli וכנגד הקופץ וחכמים אומרים אין משגיחים בכף מאזניים כל עיקר. So Alma Rabbi Yehuda Lakula V'Rabbanan Lechumma. So from there we see that this is exactly the same as what we saw before in the Gemara. There we see that Rabbi Yehuda holds leniently when it comes to measuring, and Rabbanan holds Lechumma more stringently. So Kasha Rabbi Yehuda, Kasha the Rabbanan ad Rabbanan. Okay, but now the answer is going to be a little bit different. So, Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, hatam sheino miyuchad lemida, acha miyuchad lemida. Okay, so that's what we're saying. So we're saying, according to Rabbi Yehuda, over there in the Mishnah, it talks about the scales and the weighing the meat. So that is a kli. Sorry, what's the important fact there? That you're using, what are you weighing on the scales? You're using your kli or using your knife or whatever, which is not a kli, which is miyuchad lemida. That's not what it's used for. It's not used for measuring. However, here, hacha miyuchad lemida. Here we're dealing with a kli, which is used for measuring. So as opposed to before, when we said in the first interpretation, we said Rabbi Yehuda was saying even if it's a kli that's never been used for measuring, but it could be. So there the Gemara said, why is it not a contradiction in terms? It said over there a few lines above, it's not saying which you could or you would use for measuring. Yeah, because the way, according to Rava's interpretation, Rabbi Yehuda is coming to say that anytime you have a kli, which is a specific kli that's used for measuring, we're not talking about the kli that could be used for measuring. We don't get there. We're talking about the kli that is used for measuring. Even if I don't say explicitly I want a certain measurement in it, that's what we can't use, right? So he says, therefore, that's acha miyuchad lemida. Adam sheino miyuchad lemida, acha miyuchad lemida, and therefore that's the difference between the two cases. And it's not the fact that Rabbi Yehuda is stringent in one is not a contradiction on the fact that he's more lenient in another. It's a different case. Okay. Now the Rabbanan nami lo kasha. According to the Rabbanan, it's also not going to be a kasha. Why? Hatam lo ka'avid kidavdin b'chol hacha Acha lo ka'avid keda'avdin b'cho. Very similar to the answer that we saw above, right? And he says why. Avdi inchi the makalve chamla b'mana tequila v'shat. Right, which means that that's what people do. That they would use these kelim, although they would use them to measure, they would also use them to pour in wine and give them to people and to drink. That is and therefore we don't have a contradiction between Rabbanan. We don't have a contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda. So we've resolved that either way. But the point is we have two different interpretations of our Mishnah. Right, our Mishnah said. Right, the Tanakhama said you can fill up this kli, but not b'midah. According to the first interpretation, it means lo b'midah means not a kli that is used for midah. And then Rabbi Yehuda says even a kli that could be used for midah, you could not use. According to the second interpretation, that is Rava's interpretation of the Mishnah, what does it mean? Maleli kli lo b'midah means yes, I'm talking about specifically the kli that is used for measuring, but aval lo b'midah refers to the way that what the person says. Right? And don't say that I'm filling it up in a specific measurement. And Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, kli shal midah lo imalena. Even if it was the fact that it was a kli that's used for measuring, you would not be able to fill it up, even if you didn't say explicitly anything about the fact that you are intending to measure or not. So maybe that second interpretation of Rava's that seems to fit more into the sort of the plain language of the Mishnah, but yeah, those are the two different ways. Those are two different ways of learning it. Okay, so we got up to the two dots. We got up to the first long wide line on the page. I think we'll stop there. Next week, it's not Rosh Hashanah yet, so we'll still have a shiur. Be'ezrat Hashem. Hopefully, we'll maybe be able to finish the parak before we get to Rosh Hashanah. Okay.
Rabbi, I have a quick question.
Sure.
This seems to all be related to potential business. If I'm at home and I have a 100-milliliter cup, is there any issue at all if, say, someone fill this cup up, even though it's be measuring 100 milliliters? Or is this only in respect to business?
If you are measuring if you're using it as a cup to drink, so that's okay. But if you're using it in order to measure a specific amount, so then we start getting into questions. Correct? We said measuring on Yom Tov, meaning that's the reason. There's different understandings in the Rishonim as to why. But once we establish there's an isur on measuring, so if I'm doing it even not for the sake of business, that would be prohibited, unless it's for the sake of a mitzvah, etc.
So even though it's a 100-milliliter cup, and everyone knows it's a 100-milliliter cup, and if I fill it up,
that's the cup I use to drink. To drink, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, but not for a recipe, right? If you're cooking something or baking something, that in a way that you can on Yom Tov.
Right. So you should estimate. You shouldn't be exact.
Right, you don't put it. If you need 100 milliliters, you put it in a different glass.
Yeah. Different. You have bigger kasha on Pesach when you're doing the daled kosot, and someone says, "Well, wait a minute. I don't know. Your cup is it the right measure or not?"
That's okay. That's okay. That's the Tzorach Mitzvah.
That's the Tzorach Mitzvah. Okay.
All right.
Save it.
Okay.